Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Braden Knutson and I will be your host for this webinar today. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Untangling Difficulties in the FamilySearch Family Tree. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years' experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceedingly Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona FamilySearch Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
Howdy. Welcome to BYU Family History Library webinar. We're going to talk about untangling the difficulties in FamilySearch Family Tree. I'm informed by my wife that this is a picture of embroidery floss and that they come in sets of 6 or 8 strands, and in order to use them for embroidery you have to separate the strands. I didn't look at it, and the second she saw it, she knew what it was. So it's kind of interesting. First of all, we need to talk a little bit about the FamilySearch family tree. The FamilySearch family tree, when it was first developed, came from a program called new.familysearch.org. And the files that went into new.familysearch.org included the ancestral file, which is a group of pedigree files that were submitted to the Genealogical Society of Utah, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Back during different time periods, different departments of the church had responsibility for receiving the records. But the ancestral file is mainly those 4 and 5 generation family group records that were submitted, also known as the patron file. There's lots of information in these records, and it's lineage linked, meaning that the files go back showing pedigrees of the people involved. That's I guess you'd say, the good news. The bad news is that this particular file contained a large number of duplicate entries. The second is the International Genealogical Index. This has 2 major components. The one component are what are called extracted records. These are records that were extracted for a variety of purposes from primarily English vital records, meaning birth, marriage, and death records. They also contain a substantial number of records from the ordinances that were done in the church's temples. The third set of records is the pedigree resource file. Originally, this was created to act as an online backup place for people's genealogical files. So people were told that they could use this, make a backup copy online, and that the copy would be then preserved. Well, that was true, and as a matter of fact, they provided copies of all of those pedigree resource files in a set of CDs. Eventually, the CDs were replaced by DVDs, and this program is actually ongoing. So, as part of FamilySearch Family Tree, you can still upload your file and have it included in the pedigree resource file. About 60% or so of the pedigree resource file records were also included in the pile of records that went into the new.familysearch.org program. Fourth was the church membership records from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And last were the temple records from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. All of these went into a huge database pile of records. And as a result, what we have here that became the basis of the FamilySearch family tree is about 150 years of genealogical records submissions that have been gathered together. The latest figures that I've heard is there's about 1.1 billion names in the family tree. That would probably, that includes, of course, all the records that have been submitted to the family tree, to the new.familysearch.org, and also to the family tree when it became a successor to new.familysearch.org. So what we have is a massive pile, and there's a couple of problems. One is that, of course, many people had their records submitted multiple times. During the time of the four-generation program, everyone was supposed to supply a four-generation, and so if I supplied my four-generation, my parents then supplied their four generations, and my grandparents supplied their four generations. There were already 3 copies of everybody that would have been on all of those charts. At least some of the people would have been duplicated that many times. As a result of that, many of the people in the program have also have many records. I have seen numbers as high as 860 or so copies of the same person in the file at the same time. I can presently show where people have at least 2 or 3, between 2 and 250 copies of the same person. So there's a substantial number of duplicate entries in there. The results of this is that the duplicate entries far exceed the ability of the program to handle that information presently. What happened in the new.familysearch.org program was that the records, some of the records became so large, in fact, they call them individuals of unusual size, or IOUSs. And these particular entries got so large that they were bogging down the entire system. So they put a cap on the number of combined records that could be viewed or used in new.familysearch.org. When FamilySearch Family Tree was created, it inherited that database and those limitations from new.familysearch.org. So the results was that there are still duplicate entries in Family Tree, some of which cannot be merged and cannot be resolved. Some of the entries are obviously incomplete. Now, I'm partially to blame for this because those early pedigree resource file submissions that I did were of work in progress, and I had not even bothered to mark male or female on some of the entries, and so what I look at today is to some extent a return to all of the mistakes I made in the past. So these are the kinds of things. The family tree has a great ability to call you to account for your past omissions. Anyway, so we're looking at entries that could have been better entered. One of the questions that asks constantly is whether or not all the entries in the family tree have been reviewed. There are some people who assume that because the family tree is sponsored by FamilySearch and indirectly by the church, that therefore it must be true and complete, and the answer is it is neither, and no one has ever been reviewing or monitoring any of the entries for completeness or accuracy. That basically is left up to the users of the program because that's the function that we now have as relationship to the FamilySearch family tree. Another problem that may occur is that there are wrong individuals in the families. This is part of what's called the same name, same person syndrome that we refer to in genealogy. person has a very close match. The name is the same. The person's born in the same area. Maybe the date's a little off, or the parish is different or something, but then the person is included in the same family because the names of the parents and the children appear to be the same. That works really well as long as every single person in the world had their own individual name, but the reality is that many people throughout the world have the same names. If you ever want to see how unique your own name is, just do a Google search on your name and see how many different varieties of your name will come up. Most places it is very difficult because in countries like Wales, England, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, many times there are many areas where people have same or similar names in the same small area. The next problem that appears is dates that don't work with the people involved. Here the concern is that the date is, sometimes it's just simply a mistake. The numbers have been transposed. It seems that'd be pretty obvious if the person is born in 1820 and died in 1868, and it turns out to be 18. The numbers are transposed and it comes out to be 1968 or something, or changed. So the person looks like they died when they were 120 or 30 or 40 years old. That's not necessarily the problem. The problem is that the dates that are entered are probably correct for the people involved, but that the dates themselves don't work with the rest of the family members. And they've added in people as children or spouses where those numbers don't add up. The program itself, FamilySearch Family Tree, is providing a number of error messages in the form of big red exclamation points next to the people. And the typical problems that are observed are people that are having children before they were of the age that could occur, or children who were born after the death of either the mother or the father. So these are situations that are due to the fact that the dates that are provided there don't work with the people that are involved in the entries. So the question is, how is this corrected? How do we go about correcting all of these entries in the program? The first thing that I would suggest is to examine each entry and think about it. It takes a few minutes, may take more than a few minutes, it may take a few hours, but every time you go into the program, I would take a fresh look and, as I mentioned a second ago, do the math. In other words, check to see how old the mother was when the first child and the last child was born. How old was the father? Do the birth dates and the marriage dates match up? Does it make sense that the father died before 5 of the children were born? These are the kinds of things that you want to look at as you look at the entries. Also, after making sure that the dates make sense, make sure that the locations make sense. One of the most common errors that we find in the family tree is that people put in the same name, as I mentioned, same name, same person, same name. But the issue is that the locations don't make any sense at all. The first rule of genealogy, the basic rule that I've been talking about for years now, is this: when the baby was born, the mother was there. So if we look at the physical locations, people will come to me with entries in the family tree that say things like, the father was born was in California, the mother was in Massachusetts, the baby was born in Oklahoma City. And my question is, well, how did the mother get to Oklahoma City? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense today, because it takes a couple of hours for anybody to get from any place to any place else in the United States. But as you go back in time, then the issue of travel becomes more and more crucial. understanding that railroads and things like that weren't even invented in the early 1800s. It gets to the point where the only way that the people in England, for example, could have traveled before 1830 was by foot or by or horseback or in a wagon. And so the distances that they would have gone to have babies or to be married or whatever the event was were greatly telescoped backwards into much smaller areas than we would consider today as being appropriate. Um, in families today, it is not unusual to have children living in different parts of the country, um, even on different uh, ocean sides of the United States, on the East Coast and on the West Coast. But in more recent historic times, back in the 1800s and into the 1700s, that the possibility that someone would have married someone or have been having children in more than one county or more than one state was probably not possible as well as reasonable. So it's very important to make sure that the locations make sense. One of the processes we have in the FamilySearch family tree that is now assisting in increasing its accuracy is that we are adding millions of sources every month. What that means is we are documenting the events that occur with the people. Just sort of a common, more current example would be adding a birth certificate for a birth date, adding a death certificate for a death date, a burial record for the burial date, and so forth. So that there's a specific record to which can substantiate the accuracy of any particular event. Now, we get into arguments or questions about how accurate are the sources. Well, the sources are sources, whether they're accurate or not. At least they're more accurate than making it up, than making up the information. So what we need to do is add as many sources as possible. I had the question asked just within the last 2 days, the repeated question that's been asked me over and over and over again, and that is, how many sources is it necessary to have to substantiate the entries in the family tree? And my answer is, in fact, when the person asked it, we were in a class, and the rest of the class members, as a chorus, answered the question, and that is all of them. And so we've kind of gotten that message through to some people, is that we're really not looking for any specific number of sources. It's no magic, three sources is enough or 5 sources is enough. Every source we find for the family should be included for every event. And as we continue to do research in our families, we should continue to add sources as just a matter of course. So that the records become more and more accurate and more verifiable. Now, one of the basic reasons for adding sources, besides correcting the information, is to solidify and make the records more believable. If I see that you say that so-and-so was born on such and such a date in such and such a place, and I ask you, where did you get that information? And you say, I don't know. I'm not likely to believe that it's correct. But if you do supply me with a source that I can go to and look at, if I can go look at a record that then substantiates what you've said is the date, then I'm more likely to believe it. And adding the sources is one of the basic functions that helps the FamilySearch family tree from changing constantly, which, by the way, is one of the biggest complaints. So where do I start? What do I start with? This is a view of a common pedigree issue in the family tree. You'll note on this particular slide that there are a number of colored icons on the family entries here. So those little icons there indicate information that's being communicated from FamilySearch to you about the condition of the entries as they appear in the family tree. Here what we have is a blue kind of blue colored icon. If you're colorblind, these may all be sort of shades of gray, but um, they are colored icons. We have dark purple icons, we have dark blue icons, red icons, and a gold icon. So all of these have different meanings. And if we blow that in and look at this closely, we'll see the entry, and we'll see some of these little icons. They each have a different function. The purple icons generally mean that there are no sources attached. That means that there's no substantiation for the information. The red icons with the exclamation point generally are indicating serious data errors or data problems. The gold icon here, it has to do with LDS temple work, and this particular one means that there may be temple work available for these people if more information is obtained. Okay, but what I've pulled this up to illustrate is that this particular entry talks about somebody named James Stewart, who was born in 1664, died in 1750, and was married to somebody named Mrs. Stewart. Now, I don't think Mrs. Stewart was what the name she had when she was born. I think she probably had a real name. Unfortunately, as a sort of a method of designating an unknown wife in the past, people used a designation like this. Mrs. Stewart was an accepted designation for an unknown wife of someone named James Stewart. As long as the husband's name was there, the situation was satisfactory. And another problem is you'll see that Mrs. Stewart, whatever her name is, was born in 1669, but she has no death place or date. Nothing there telling us. So what we need to do here, this when you reach an entry like this with information that is approximate, estimated, or simply supplied to show a placeholder of information, then that particular entry is a question mark. That's where we get back to examining a family tree, and once we hit this level, we know that we are not going to go any further with any accuracy at all. It really needs to be verified before it's accurate. And the existence of a big red exclamation point back there is a fairly good indication that we've got some data problems. So right now we have missing date and place, and we have a missing name for that person. And if we go further back, everything beyond this particular entry, so everything here from James Stewart and Mrs. Stewart on back, is suspect. We do not have information that can be verified, and as a matter of fact, as we move back even one step further on the pedigree that's on FamilySearch Family Tree, we see that there are even more red icons appearing, indicating serious data problems. So this is kind of the end of the line as far as concerned. Now the names may go back 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, maybe 12 generations. I mean, there may be names that go all the way back to Charlemagne and perhaps even back to Adam on this line. But the reliability of anything past this point is suspect because the information is incomplete and unsubstantiated. So to put it very briefly, these connections are not believable. There's nothing here that shows me that this information could be correct. So would it help you also to know that the James Stewart that we just looked at has listed with him 14 wives, 14 different wives, including many who are named Mrs. Stewart, or Mrs. Elizabeth Stewart, or Elizabeth Johnson, or any other names. In fact, 14 different ones. Barring the fact that this person married 14 different wives, which I guess was conceivable. Probably would have gotten him into some kind of notoriety at the time that he was living back there in the 1600s to have married that many women. Even if that were possible, because you look at looking at the names, you see how many of them are duplicates and many of them are not complete or have any kind of verification. Oh, okay, we got a question. The teal green icon generally means, and I'm assuming that, I'll go back a to that teal green icon with the temple on it. I guess that's what you're talking about. The question is, the teal green icon is means that someone has reserved that particular temple ordinance so that may be available. Someone at one point in time that was a green icon, meaning there was temple work available. Someone went through and clicked on it, turned it into a ordinances are pending. As an editorial comment here, the fact that there were ordinances pending in this situation where there was no information to substantiate the relationship of these people is a question. It's really an issue. Okay, let's go back to where we are with James Stewart and his 14 wives. So where do I start? How do I get going on this process so that we can clean up this situation that now exists on the FamilySearch family tree? This is the general rule. The general rule is start with the first person in the line, in your pedigree line, with verifiable names, dates, and places. Okay, so as I've worked with people on the family tree, one of the questions that comes in, and as I've been helping people with their genealogy, I have people come in and say, I need help finding my great-great-great-grandfather. And I say, okay, that's great. Let's sit down and look at it. And so we sit down and start looking, and I say, well, who are these people? And they say, what do you mean? I say, well, who is this person that's supposed to be the child of your missing great-great-great-great whatever grandfather? And they'll say, well, I don't know. The name's right there. And I'll say, well, what do you know about him? They'll say, nothing. I'll say, well, let's move down a little bit, closer to the present. How about his child here? How do you know this person? Well, I don't. What are you asking? I'm saying, do you know where he lived? No. Do you know what he did for a living? No. What church he belonged to? No. Uh, Anything about him at all? No, I just know a name there. Well, let's keep going down the list here. So I will keep coming forward in time. I have gotten down to the parents of the person I'm sitting there with and ask them information about their mother and their father, and they don't even know the middle names of their parents or where they lived or what they did. Okay, so we have to start with the first person that has verifiable names and places. We can't rely on our memory. We can't rely on what our great aunt told us was how everybody was related. We need to see if someone has put in sources, if someone has added information that would verify it. Recently started some research on one of my family lines, and discovered that beginning with my great-great-grandfather, there were no records substantiating any birth, marriage, or death for any of the rest of the people in the line. Not one record that substantiated that where these people were born, married, or died. So that required me to start doing all of that work over again. Now, this is not a criticism, it's a statement of the condition. And it's important to understand that there was not that kind of an emphasis in past years. We weren't asking people, and we weren't requiring anybody to provide substantiation in the form of sources before entering information into a pedigree chart or family group record. So a lot of this information was gathered when these people knew the people firsthand, and that's one of the places where they can say there's a source. In other words, they can say, well, I got this information from my grandmother, and she wrote it down during her lifetime, and this tells where she was born and who her parents were. That's good information, but it's not necessarily correct information. Um, my great grandmother wrote down where her grandfather, or where her own father, my great great grandfather, was born, and that turned out to be uh, not correct, and took me 15 years to figure out where he really was born. But it was copied over and over and over again into pedigrees and into online family trees as his birthplace, even though the place did not exist. Okay, so in this line, I started with Lydia Stewart. Okay, this is the Stewart line that we looked at a few seconds ago. Lydia Stewart, born 1783, died 1825, because she was well documented. So we have a whole long list of sources attached to Lydia Stewart documenting her. How do I know that they're correct? Well, I can open them up one by one, look at them, evaluate them, see whether or not I believe that the contents of these sources are correct, and draw my own conclusion. If I don't think there's enough substantiation here, or parts of her life that matter for tracking backward are not adequate, then I can simply make whatever adjustments I need to the family tree to reflect the fact that there isn't any documentation. So that's kind of the threshold. But as you move back in time, and as I examine each of the sources, I may find that the information that is actually in the sources is not reflected in the tree. And so I need to make some changes to the family tree. One of the most common ones I find not infrequently is I will look at a date in the record which seems a little bit odd, and then I will look at all the sources, and I will find a source for a birth record in a parish or whatever that simply contradicts the information that's been already entered for the person. So whoever attached the source didn't bother to look at the source and transfer the information that was contained in that source into the details for the individual in the family tree. And that's part of the problem with establishing and cleaning up the information that's there. For us to untangle those knots that are created by having information that's incomplete or inaccurate, we really need to retreat back to the point where that information can be substantiated from some kind of a source. Now, what I'm showing here on the side is one of them is a census record. The other record that's showed on here on the slide is a find a grave record. Now, the find a grave record has a picture of the grave marker, and if I can identify that as the correct person, having had that picture taken in the cemetery where I know that the person was buried or whatever, then that may be a record and a source for additional information. But a program like Find a Grave, for example, also goes on and lists all sorts of other relatives who may be in the database. There is no real guarantee, and especially no absolute guarantee, that these people are related to either the deceased in the diagram, or somehow related after the fact as cousins or whatever of that person. Now, I noticed in this, as I looked at Lydia Stewart, as I mentioned with other lines that I found in the family tree, is there are no birth sources listed for Lydia Stewart Tanner. So she is so there's a lot of sources here, all of which talk about her arrival in in Utah or her death in Utah, but they don't talk about her birth, christening, or any other records that substantiate who she was or where she was born. So the sheer number of sources really has no basis on the accuracy of the record, because there could be 100 sources here, and if there still were no birth sources or other identifying sources, we would have an incomplete gap between Lydia Stewart and her parents. As I mentioned here, the Find a Grave record is a first primary source for the information that's on the grave marker. Okay, so there could be about 3 or 4 different things here that could occur. First of all, the information on the grave marker may or may not be correct. In other words, when they filled in the grave marker, they may have known where this person was born, or they may not have known where this person was born. And the second part of it is that in this particular case, the information that we see comes from Find a Grave, and Find a Grave includes all sorts of biographical information, none of which is particularly substantiated or being able to be verified by other independent sources. So Find a Grave, by the way, is not considered a primary source or even a source at all for all this additional linkage and family relationships. Those are created through the burials that may have been cataloged by this particular program at the time. This is not a reflection on the accuracy or the value of the records from Find a Grave, but it is a reflection on the any other information that may contain here, like the list of children, parents, siblings, all that kind of stuff. So this particular birth information is not what you would call primary information. Primary information from a death record is the death. A birth is something that occurred at a far distant time, hopefully a far distant time from the death, but from the birth. But even if they're very close together, they're still not. They rely on other information which isn't substantiated or verified. Now this one says that it gives us another source, that the wife of John Tanner died at 41 years, 6 months, 13 days, and it's cataloged by the Stanley and Ruth Harris, from the collection of the New York State Library. So there is a source for some of the information, particularly the death information, and a way to calculate the birth information. So these particular dates may have some validity. But until that is verified, the information beyond the point of John Tanner and Lydia Stewart is unsupported and conjectural. There's just no way in the world that you can tell if William Stewart is Lydia Stewart's father, and if Amy Huntington is her mother. You might notice, if you go back one more generation to the right, that Amy Huntington's father's name is Will Hutton, and his mother's name is Joan Hutton. Couple of real issues there. First of all, did Will Hutton married another girl or another lady named Joan Hutton, or did they get ready? Did she change her name after some event, like when he died or when they got married or whatever? It doesn't help us to see that there's no death dates for either of those people, information about their death other than deceased. So let's look at this William Stewart. who's now the supposedly the father of Lydia Stewart, his wife's Amy Huntington. Here's William Stewart, the next one out, whose wife is supposedly Margaret Sanderson. And Margaret Sanderson is about as covered with, has such a lack of information as any of the other entries here. Then we notice here that there's also a difference in the names between Amy Huntington and William Hutton and his wife Joan Hutton. So we're noticing that the names change. Okay, so you just can't ignore incomplete and contradictory information. I mean, there's just, it's a matter of creating an accurate record. If I didn't rely on the fact that I have a sense of accuracy and appropriateness and right, then I wouldn't be able to do this at all. I might as well just copy it and forget it. And, you know, I go find the first one that goes back to Adam, copy it, and say I'm done with my genealogy. Good night. Thank you very much. But the important thing here is that the second you start copying something, you've gone away from doing research. If you think doing research is getting into ancestry and copying somebody's family tree, then you've missed the point of the whole process. Research is where you determine if what there is correct, then correcting it, and you have to actually do some research to determine what is correct. So if I'm looking at Amy Stewart or whoever I was in my file, and it's missing a death date and a death place, then that's probably information that I would like to have, partially to complete and have an understanding of what I need to do, but also to see if it's consistent, that there's anything in there that should consistently that I should be aware of consistently. So basically the family line, any of these family lines out there, although there may be names going back into antiquity, in even ancient times, they essentially end with the last verified person. I've debated over one thing about the FamilySearch family tree is that it's a wiki. It's an open program, openly collaborative program, unified program, meaning everyone's looking at the same information and the same datas, and when you and anyone can correct or add or delete or whatever what the information that's there. But the debate is this: I go back in my lines and I find that I am at the end of the information that I have I have by myself accumulated over a number of years, and I find that that they go that the pedigree goes well beyond my personal end of line people. So what should I do about it? Should I go in and lop off the extra people that I don't agree with? The answer is I really can't do that until I have taken the effort to determine whether or not they're correct or not. In one line that I was researching for my own line, I did not find any birth, death, or marriage information. But as I did find that information, I found that everything in the tree was substantially correct. So regardless of whether or not they had sources, the people had been accurate. And that was helpful, because then I could begin to rely on some of the other things that they did that I still have yet to verify. So let's look at Lydia Stewart's father, William Stewart. William Stewart was born in 5 November 1740 in a place called Lunenburg, Worcester, Massachusetts, United States, okay, in 1740. First of all, that's interesting that he was born in the United States in 1740. The last time I checked, the Constitution was ratified, as I mentioned, in 1789. Maybe I haven't mentioned that yet, but it was. So I don't think we had a United States of America until 1789. Or, some people consider that from the Declaration of Independence, 1776, that's the most popular date. That's not accurate. That's the date that they declared independence, not the date that they were in existence as a country, and so, or we were as in existence as a country. So United States is wrong. What about Massachusetts? Was Massachusetts around in 1740? Well, not really either, as it is today. And what about Worcester County and Lunenburg, the town? Well, let's see how they fare. So let's start looking at all those different places. And there's no marriage place. And here's what the record shows so far. This is what we've looked at so far. William Stewart was supposedly born in Lunenburg, Worcester, Massachusetts, United States in 1740. His wife, Amy Huntington, was supposedly born in Mansfield, Holland, Connecticut in 1751. The three children were born in Greenwich, Washington, New York, Easton, Albany, New York, and Charlotte, New York, United States. Well, this lady really know how to move. That's quite a loop out there to get around and back in the early 1700s to find and to melt and to consider as real. Okay. So let's, as I mentioned, the United States began at the earliest after 1776. Now, Williams Find a Grave Memorial says that he was born in Bolton, Warren County, New York. And the research needs to start with a birthplace for Lydia. Here's a quote from my daughter's blog, The Ancestor Files, where she addressed this specific information. The source and correct all entries for all children and grandchildren and their families. Please do not make changes unless you have documentation to back up your changes. Documentation does not include personal genealogical records unless you have family records created at the time of the events, but documentation does include vital and government and church records and certain histories. Okay, this is sort of her general statement on what to rely on what we need to know about. None of the early records are reliable. They're the ones that are earlier than the Hutton, than Stewart and Hutton's here in this particular line. And in fact, that line, the Stewart line, finally ends back in the 1400s with no sources and doesn't resolve any of the issues that are raised in the later records. So the answer to this is any pedigree is only reliable as its sources. If we look at, like I have on many occasions, one of the things about Ancestry.com, for example, a very valuable program with lots and lots of resources, one of the things they have are hundreds of thousands, probably over 1 million, family trees that have been created and recorded on the program. And one of the things that they do when you go into the program is they match your family tree with somebody else's family tree. So they say, here's this person in your tree, and here's the same person in this other person's family tree. There's twofold here. One is you get knowledge of a relative, and secondly, you can see if there's some additional information that they have that you might not have ever found. So what happens there is that you look at the number of linked sources to those individuals, and you might find somebody, for example, who has only one source, and that one source is they copied their family tree from some other family tree. Well, that's not a source. It doesn't tell you any more information about where the information came from than having nothing there. And it is my experience that in looking at the family trees on Ancestry, that there are very few percentage of them, is very low, that have any more than just a very, very bare minimum number of sources, like one or two. Which is pretty remarkable, since you have a program that automatically asks sources and tells you where you can find all these sources. So apparently people aren't even really clicking on the green arrows and adding the sources in that they're suggested to. Secondly, there's no free lunch. We have to do some of the research. There's kind of a reticence on the part of genealogists. Perhaps it's associated with a little bit of inexperience. But the real question here is, at some point you actually need to go outside of what you have already have in your records and find some more records. And that's what we call doing some research, trying to find a record or source for some of those birth, death, or marriage dates that are missing. Another thing that's important is that almost all the lines on the family tree are similar to this one. I've kind of had a standing challenge out there to the world. I've said over and over again that if you give me 10, 15 minutes with your family tree, I can show you on FamilySearch or any other program where they break down, where you have information that's unsupportable and doesn't have any, you can't claim that it's correct. So there may be somebody out there that has done such a fabulous slow job of slowly creating their tree and slowly aggregating people that what they do have is very reliable and very helpful. If that's the case, that's great. But my experience is that those people are pretty few and far between. And one of the next things is to be ready to revise traditionally accepted genealogies. Just because you got this from someone that you thought was reliable, such as your distant relative, does not mean that that person had the records that you have today, or that that person was correct. They may not have done the research at all. They may have just simply copied someone else. So it's important to be available, to make your mind open enough that when a contrary information is received from a record source, that you're able to incorporate it, even if it contradicts something that you've believed all your life to be correct. I remember one situation. I was demonstrating the MyHeritage file, which has a lot of record hints called record matches, and record detective, adding even more record hints. In this case, I was helping a family, and I was sitting there next to the father of the family, and I was showing him how I could add records from MyHeritage. And his mother was there, and she was the genealogist, and so I put in a marriage date for this family that I'd added, and she said, "No, that's not correct." "No." And I said, "Well, what do you mean it's not correct?" And she said, "Well, I know the date. That is not the date that that person was married." And I said, "Oh, well, do you know where I got this information?" And she said, "No, but it's wrong." And I said, "Okay, well, let me show you where I got it. I got it out of the marriage certificate." And she said, "Oh my goodness, there's a marriage certificate? We've always had that as a different date," and on and on and on. Okay, well, that's kind of unfortunately, that's not as uncommon as it should be, that we are ready to accept information that is passed on to us without challenge and without proper documentation. Okay, so our procedures are to check for duplicates and merge all the duplicates. That would be the first thing. There's a little app program called Find a Record, which is in the FamilySearch.org app gallery. which can be found at the bottom of the FamilySearch.org startup page. If you go clear to the bottom, you'll find the app gallery, and then in the app gallery, you'll find a program called Find a Record. It's not the only one that does this, but it's a pretty interesting one. And you can uncheck all of the other things that it will find and leave only check for duplicates, and it will find a lot of duplicates in your file. So there are outside third-party ways of addressing the problem of duplicates in the family tree. The second part of this is to add sources for as many places as possible, as many events in the person's life, and then to check the places and the dates that they are correct and that they are consistent with reality, that mothers weren't having children when they were 3 years old and babies weren't being born 5 and 6 years after the father died. Which seems to be pretty common out there right now. When you get these dates, places, and other things corrected, the natural effect of this will be that you'll be adding people to the family tree, because by correcting the dates and places, you're probably putting yourself in a position to find more people rather than using it up. So what do we know about Lydia? According to her gravestone, Lydia was born on 18 November 1783. Her oldest son records say she was born in Greenwich, New York, which did not exist at the time, and she was likely born in Argyle, Charlotte, New York. What do we need to do? Verify the dates and the birthplaces of each of the children, make the corrections, and go back to the issues raised and see what we need to do next. And whenever you're doing this, resist the temptation to jump back in time before the records are substantiated. One of the most things that contributes to this is the fan view of a pedigree, where you have like a colorful fan of all of your ancestors going back, and then you find there's some missing holes back there. It's very tempting to try to fill in the hole. And the answer to that is, before you start filling in that hole, make sure you have substantiated and created a chain of sources going back to that far and back to that person. Okay, well, that's what we have today. Do we have any questions? Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you for watching. This has been a webinar sponsored. Well, while we're waiting, I'll tell this, and then we'll see if there's a question. Thanks for watching, and this has been a production of the BYU Family History Library. That's Brigham Young University Family History Library in Provo, Utah. And if you would subscribe to our YouTube channel at the BYU Family History Library youtube.com channel, you will receive notice of all of the webinars as they are completed and recorded. If you go to the BYU Family History Library webpage on byu.edu, you will find a schedule of upcoming webinars, and you can watch them in person or listen in person if you wish to do so. So you're invited to subscribe. Thank you.